What is up, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Terminator Training Show. I'm Kevin Smith. Today, we are going to talk all about heat training and why it's important and why you should consider it and how to do it and how to stay safe when you're doing it and the difference between passive and active heat training, all things heat training in this one episode. I'm not going to get super granular down to the nitty-gritty details, but I will talk a little bit about adaptations and science just to kind of help drive points home. But we will keep this short and sweet and tactical and provide the things that you really want to focus on in order to A, do your heat training properly, and also B, do it safely, and C, hopefully show up to a race, event, selection, whatever it is, and crush it because you did the right things leading into it. And of course, the main meat and potatoes of your preparation is going to be your training quality and your recovery. But also, if you totally ignore or sleep on or just overlook the potential benefits of heat training, then you are not going to show up and put your potential performance up that you otherwise could if you had done that. So hopefully this episode will help convince you that it's really important and that you should not sleep on it. So without further ado, let's start with what heat training is. Heat training is either passively or actively exposing yourself to heat so that your body performs better in high heat environments. And passive, I'll get into specific examples of these a little bit later and talk about the differences, pros and cons, but passive heat training is something like going and sitting in a sauna or a hot bath or a hot tub, whereas active heat training is kind of what it sounds like. You go outside in hot weather. Of course, you have to have access to hot weather, or you could bundle up and you actually train in the heat. So there's pros and cons to both, but both are definitely way better than nothing. And I'll talk exactly how to kind of conceptualize them and put them together depending on where you live, what you have access to, your timeline, and so on and so forth. But if you are one of the following people, basically anyone, honestly, but especially important for anyone going to ranger school or a summertime selection or even a selection in the spring or the fall in a hotter area where it's going to be relatively hot. I'll talk exactly about like what constitutes hot and what is kind of hot, pretty hot, damn hot a little bit later. But if you are potentially going to be having to perform in hot weather, whether it's running, rucking, strongman events, or a Spartan race, or whatever your cup of tea is, then it's absolutely applies to you and you should definitely do it. And you should definitely listen to the specifics of this episode because you potentially could pay a big price if you don't. And I am not joking when I say, like, in the military especially, and this probably happens civilian side too, people die every year because they are not acclimated to the heat and they go and they overdo it. Either that or they get forced to overdo it, like they're doing a forced march or a forced run and they're just not ready for it. Maybe totally fine fitness wise, but they're just not adapted to the heat and therefore it's too much of a stressor for their body and they have a serious heat injury, whether heat stroke, heat exhaustion, heat cramps, like these very significant debilitating cramps, and or they pass away, like literally die. It happens more often than it should, to be honest with you. So it's that important. Safety aside, it also matters for performance because heat almost acts as like a jacket that you put on. So if you want to go out and it's 45 degrees out and you want to run your fastest 5 mile, you possibly can, and you decide to put a jacket and sweatpants on, which could potentially be a beneficial thing to do for training. We'll talk specifics about that later. But for this analogy, just picture you have two options. One, you can run fully bundled up in 45 degree weather, or maybe you can wear some gloves and shorts and a long sleeve shirt. So you're like appropriate running attire for that weather. Which one do you think you'll perform better in? And which one do you think will be less of a stressor on your body? Of course, when you're appropriately clothed and you're not putting a jacket on. Well, sometimes you don't have that option. Sometimes it's 95 degrees out and 80% humidity and you have to go out and run 5 miles, or you have to go out and do a running workout or a ruck, whatever it is. That is kind of what heat acts as. It's going to limit your performance for many different reasons. And also, it's particularly a problem or a factor for rucking, because if you think about wearing a ruck, it's going to trap all that heat in. So even if you are downgraded, like for summer selections, Ranger School, usually they will have you wear your pants, like your military pants, but they allow you to take your blouse off, so you're just in a t-shirt. But that ruck still adds another layer that basically traps a lot of that upper body heat in. That core temperature stays higher because of the ruck. And also, of course, you're going to be exerting yourself quite significantly on a ruck, because it's another 50 pounds, 60 pounds that you have to travel with. And most likely you're trying to do that fast. So it's especially a factor for rucking. And I would say rucking is probably even a little bit more dangerous to do in the heat. And it's probably going to be affected, especially longer distances. It's going to be affected more than running. Of course, running is still absolutely going to be affected, even if you are wearing minimal clothing, but it's just something to consider. So it's very, very important for anyone who falls into any of those categories is prepping for any of those things. Some of the major effects of the heat, some of the things that you might notice in the heat, your core temperature is inherently going to be higher. So core temperature is one major factor of fatigue that a lot of people overlook. Most people think that the only thing they have to focus on in hot weather in order to not get any sort of heat injury and to perform well is making sure they stay hydrated, which is true. You do have to focus on hydration. However, that is not the only thing you have to focus on. The fact that your core temperature is inherently going to be higher, it will make your heart have to work harder. It will make all of your organs, to include your muscles, your actual muscles that are propelling you forward and allowing you to perform, it will heat those up. And therefore, it's going to reduce your performance acutely. Hydration, of course, is a big factor as well. And generally, if it's hot out, you're just not going to be able to take in enough water and electrolytes in sufficient volume to completely stay perfectly hydrated. The game you're kind of playing, and I will get into specifics later, is a dehydration mitigation game. But if you are dehydrated by like 2%, if you lose 2% of your body weight on a run, for example, say you're 200 pounds, you get back from your run and you're 196 pounds. You did not just burn 4 pounds of fat on one run. The weight you lost was mostly water, and therefore that would be a 2% dehydration. Even if you were taking in water the entire time, come back with a net 4 pound loss, then you are going to see performance losses of 4 to 6% just from that 2% water loss. And I've gone on several runs, even hydrating and fueling the entire time, where I've lost well over 4 pounds. And I'm about 200 pounds, oddly enough. And it definitely will detrimentally affect your performance. So dehydration, core temperature, and your heart is working overtime, not only to keep you cool, your core temperature down, and your organs from overheating, but it's also working harder to perfuse your muscles. Your heart's going to be working hard anyway because you're running or rucking hard or biking hard, whatever your modality is, but it's kind of working overtime here. So your RPE, your rate of perceived exertion, even at the same paces that you're used to running, is going to be higher. So say you are normally running a tempo effort at a 7-minute mile pace, and it happens to be 90 degrees out with 87% humidity, and the dew point is, say, 78 degrees, which is very, very miserable and hot, and will have a significant effect on your performance. Your tempo pace that day, even though you're maintaining that same RPE, if you try to hit that 7-minute per mile tempo pace that day, your RPE is inherently just going to be higher than it normally is. Or if you maintain that RPE, say your tempo RPE, rate of perceived effort, out of 10 is a 7.5. If you try and hit that 7-minute mile pace when it's hot out, it's probably going to be an 8.5 or 9, depending on how acclimated you are. That's just the nature of it. It's going to increase the RPE of really anything, or it's going to reduce your performance at the same RPE. So consider that as well. However, you can mitigate all these effects by adapting. And some of the things that occur inside your body, I'm not going to get super duper into the weeds with it, but I think it's important to talk about some of them. So first, you're just going to become better at sweating. You're going to be a more efficient sweater. There are a few different mechanisms by which this occurs. One, you are going to start sweating faster. Yes, sweating and losing water dehydrates you for sure, but also it's important. People who sweat more and faster and more efficiently tend to be able to cool themselves better. Their bodies naturally, their core temperature stays lower. So being a more efficient sweater is super important, and that involves sweating faster. So you have faster sweat onset, you have higher sweat volume, which is just a higher overall sweat output. You also lose less sodium in your sweat. So sodium is one of the electrolytes, and it's the one that you lose most out of all of the electrolytes: potassium, magnesium, sodium. You're going to lose sodium more during training than any other one. And the better adapted you are to the heat, the less sodium you're going to lose. It's not no sodium, but it's just less than it would be if you were not adapted well to the heat. So you're not losing these really critical electrolytes at as fast of a rate when you're heat adapted, which is super important. Additionally, it's going to increase your plasma volume. Your plasma is important for a couple different things. One, perfusing your muscles, bringing oxygen to your muscles. And two, it also helps keep your body cool. So it helps perfuse the peripheries. Peripheries is just far away from your heart. And the more plasma volume you have, the cooler you're going to be able to keep yourself, as well as the better your muscles are going to actually utilize oxygen, or you're going to get the oxygen to your musculature in a more efficient manner. Additionally, your cardiovascular system as a whole is going to be more efficient. So you're going to have a lower heart rate at the same effort or same workload. You are going to have higher stroke volume, which means blood pumped by the heart per beat, which is a good thing. You want more blood pumped by the heart. That's one of the main benefits of doing zone 2 or aerobic conditioning, is it increases your stroke volume, but also heat exposure can also increase your stroke volume further. And that is a definite benefit for any sort of performance. And it's also going to keep your blood pressure more stable. So you're going to see less of a delta between your regular blood pressure and what it otherwise would be if you were not heat adapted. Of course, too, another very important reason, although most people think this is like the only thing that happens, is it makes you mentally tougher. It's going to give you more confidence in your ability to potentially perform in the future in the heat. But it's also just going to allow you to perceive that as less of a stressor just because you're exposing yourself to it. Certain things for certain people are different magnitudes of stress. One person might see a spider and absolutely lose their mind. Another person might see a spider and let it crawl on them. It's still the exact same thing, but they perceive it differently because one person probably has exposed themselves to spiders more often, whereas the other person is probably, since they're terrified of them, probably avoids them. Heat is the same way. If you consistently train in it or expose yourself to it, you're going to perceive it as less of a stressor. It's not going to be as daunting or miserable, and you're going to have more confidence performing in the heat. Whereas if you never do, and all of a sudden you have a race or a ruck or a selection, it's going to be hot as hell, you're not going to be very confident in your ability to perform in that heat, and you're also not going to have that exposure prior to that allows you to perceive it as less of a brutal, daunting, demanding task. And then lastly, this one is a pretty minor thing and really applies to like really higher level individuals, but it can potentially make you more metabolically efficient. So it can potentially delay how long it takes you to tap into glycogen. It can be what's called glycogen sparing. And glycogen, if you've been listening for any amount of time, you know what it is, but just to recap, it is stored sugar or stored carbohydrates in your musculature. And it's very important for either really long training or really intense training. Once you get out of that aerobic zone, you get into your lactate zone or your glycolytic zone. Glycolytic literally means to break down carbohydrates or break down sugar. Glycolysis is another word for it. The thing about glycogen is it's not infinite. So the longer you can spare it or the longer you can delay tapping into it, and the lower the delta of glycogen that you lose through output, the better, because you're going to just perform better and you're going to have more glycogen for later stages when you need it. And of course, your intra-workout fueling, carbohydrate intake, that's going to keep your glycogen stores higher as well. And it's going to give you kind of a backup in the form of circulating glucose or circulating sugar in your bloodstream from recent carbohydrate intake. But either way, that is still a factor that's not super duper relevant to everybody, but it's still a potential benefit of heat training. There's some mixed data on that, so I wouldn't say like it's going to make a massive measurable difference, but mechanistically there is a difference according to data. So now that we have a little bit of an idea of who should do it and some of the things that happen inside your body from heat training, let's talk a little bit about methods, different ways to acclimate or acclimatize yourself to the heat. And on that note, let's define those two things. Kind of semantics, doesn't really matter that much, but acclimate is to get your body used to heat using any environment whatsoever. So it does not necessarily mean that you're actually in the climate that you're going to be performing in. Whereas acclimatization means you're actually immersing yourself in that environment. For example, If I had a race in Texas and it was in the summertime and I wanted to acclimatize to that environment, I might move to Texas like a month early, or maybe not move there, but I would go there and do like the last month of my training in Texas. So I'm acclimatizing to that exact climate or a similar climate, Oklahoma or something like that, that's hot and humid. Acclimation just means I don't really have access to that exact climate, and I'm going to go in the sauna, or I'm going to take hot baths, or I'm going to go in the hot tub on a regular basis. I'm going to acclimate to the heat. So doesn't matter all that much, and I might use them interchangeably. Most people do. Acclimate is just easier to say usually, but there's a small difference. But beyond that, we have a couple different types of heat exposure, passive and active. For passive, think not training. So you're in a hot environment, but you're not actually training in that hot environment. So you're sitting in a sauna, or you are taking a hot tub, or something along those lines that exposes you to heat, but you're not actually training in that heat. Whereas active is you're actually doing a training session in the heat. Pretty simple distinction, but they're both really important. And I'm going to talk exactly how to approach either one and some of the pros and cons here in a bit. But first, let's talk about what counts as hot. We're going to talk weather, don't think about saunas or anything like that. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but think about weather right now. So I'm going to go down a few different temperature ranges and talk about how much it's going to potentially affect. I'm not going to use exact percentages or numbers because it's hard to measure. I'm going to use words like severe, very, relatively, kinda, things like that. Just very vanilla stuff, but it'll still allow you to kind of picture it. So the main factor that will determine whether something is hot or not, like the weather is hot or not, is going to be the dew point. You might notice that if you live somewhere that has like warm, not hot, but warm and humid mornings, and then the humidity throughout the day drops a little bit and the temperature goes up, you may notice that it's not really all that much more comfortable to do your training in the morning, even though it's cooler, the temperature is cooler. And oftentimes that's because the dew point is still high. So many times here in North Carolina, it'll be 78 degrees in the morning, the temperature, but the dew point will be like 76. And although the temperature is not that much higher than the dew point, 76, anything higher than 75, by the way, is like the top, like severe stress. And later in the day, maybe the temperature is 90 degrees, but the humidity has dropped significantly. And maybe the dew point is even lower. Maybe the dew point's in the high 60s now. Although the sun is a big factor, doing this in the sun versus the shade versus the morning versus peak daytime, that also makes a big difference. Even if the dew point may be a little bit lower, you might find that you can actually perform a little better later in the day because the dew point's lower. So that's the main factor we're looking at. Anything higher than 75, like I said, is severe. 70 to 75 is going to have like major effects. And by the way, when I say severe, that also means that the adaptations are significant. So severe is basically the classification by which it affects your performance. So 75 or higher is going to severely affect your performance, but also is going to give you great heat adaptations if you train in it. Now that that's out of the way, let's go to 70 to 75. So that's going to be major adaptations or significant performance effects. 65 to 70 is going to be good. Like that's a pretty solid temperature. You can still get great adaptations. It's not incredible, but it's solid. 60 to 65, mild. 50 to 60 is a little to no effect. And then like 40 to 50 is most endurance world records have been set in 40 to 50 degree weather. That is like perfect running or biking or whatever environment, not cold enough for you to really have to feel the potential negative effects of the cold, like cold limbs and increased warm-up times and things like that, but also not hot enough to where the heat is going to play a major role in decreasing your performance. All right, so now that we have that understanding, let's talk about active acclimation or acclimatization, either one. So this is when you either go and train in hot weather. If you have access to hot weather, great, go train in it. Or you simulate hot weather by wearing extra layers. And there are some pros and cons to wearing extra layers. One, if you have no other option and you don't really have access to hot weather, and maybe you are doing some passive like sauna work, but you also want to get used to actually training in the heat and performing in the heat, there could be some benefits to wearing extra layers occasionally, not all the time. But the potential downsides of that, one, it's kind of annoying, but beyond that, it's for a lot of people going to affect their gait. So if you are just bundling up in a ton of layers and going out for a run, it's going to affect the way you actually perform that run. Now, if you're doing easier runs, which I recommend doing most of your runs in the heat, easier runs or longer runs, and I'll get into why here in a little bit, then it's not a huge deal. But if you're going out and doing speed work or tempo work in a sweatsuit, probably not the best idea. You can do your cross training in the heat in the sweatsuit. That's a really solid option. But yeah, it's not perfect, but it's also better than nothing. The thing about active that is a very good thing is that it's very specific. So you are actually training the way that you're going to potentially be performing in the heat. So passive is not specific. You're just sitting there in the sauna or a bath. Active, you're actually doing that activity. So it's heat training. That being said, it is more fatiguing than regular training in normal weather. The same exact run at the same exact effort at the same exact whatever is going to be a bigger recovery cost when you do it in the hot weather than it would be if you do it in the cold weather. That's just the way it is, and that is a potential con. It's not like a go or no-go thing. Like, you still definitely can do it, but it's also something to consider is that, like, you're not going to recover quite as well as you usually do from that training session as you would if it was cool. Additionally, it's going to acutely affect your performance that day. So going back to that tempo run example that I used earlier, you're going to be slower that day. You're not going to make the same speed adaptations. If you're in a specific race phase and you want to do most of your running at a desired race pace, you're either going to have to go slower and just accept the fact that you're getting more heat adaptations than actual speed adaptations, or you're going to go the same pace, but it's going to be a higher RPE. It's going to be more of a stressor. And even though you are getting those heat and speed adaptations, it's still going to be more of a recovery burden. So again, these aren't like go or no-go criteria. They're just things to consider as you go about them. Generally speaking, active heat training is best done on non-speed specific sessions. It's more beneficial to do it on systemic type sessions. So if you think about it, a systemic type session would be you're going for just general aerobic development. So you're doing a long run without speed components or without quality components. You're doing an easy run. You're doing a cross training session. Something like that where speed doesn't matter that much. You're just going for general systemic adaptations. And oh, by the way, you're doing it in hot weather. So you're also going to get speed adaptations and you're spending a decent amount of time out in the heat. And it's not going to potentially negatively affect your speed adaptations because you can do those either at a different time of day, depending on where you live, or you can do them indoors in climate control. And I would recommend at least doing some of your speed work not in the heat. For some people, it might be better off to just sacrifice a little bit of speed adaptation for just doing most of their training in the heat. That's what I do over the summer. I don't really have like super specific speed goals. So I just accept the fact that I'm not going to get quite the same speed adaptations, but I will get heat adaptations. But for other people, if you have like serious goals to run a race at a certain pace or to go and hit a certain 2 mile or 5 mile or whatever it is for a selection, school, whatever, doing that always in the heat, you're going to lose out a little bit. Now, at lower levels, like military levels, doesn't matter all that much, but it's definitely something to consider. If you have access to a treadmill and that treadmill happens to be in a climate controlled environment and most of your speed work you do on that treadmill, and occasionally maybe you go out and you do some speed or tempo in the hot weather, that would probably be the best idea. And then you do, of course, your easy stuff, or you do some passive stuff, which I'll talk about next. That would be a pretty solid option. Let's discuss passive acclimation. So generally, this is sauna, hot baths, hot tub, any hot environment that you can expose yourself to. It may not be exactly like the environment that you're going to be performing in. Usually these things aren't super humid, although steam showers, steam rooms are relatively humid. Those work too. But any way you slice it, they're still going to be beneficial. So just take that for what it's worth. And by the way, a lot of people will say like, oh, I don't have sauna access. You don't need sauna access. If you have access to a bath, you can do this. Just make the bath hot. Now you can go overboard with the bath, something in the 103 to 104, maybe 105 at the most range. Guys will get way carried away with it and they'll just scald the shit out of themselves. That's totally not worth it. Not necessary. Anything that makes you sweat is good enough for a bath, but that 103, 104 is pretty good range. The thing about passive acclimation versus active is it's less specific, like I said, but also it's less fatiguing. You're just sitting in that. It's not a zero stress thing. It's still a stressor. Heat is just going to be a stressor regardless. And therefore it's going to potentially affect recovery a little bit, but it's nowhere near going out and smashing a 5 mile tempo run in hot weather versus, sitting in a sauna for 30 minutes and sweating, just sitting still. So that is one potential upside, but also it's less specific. So that's one potential downside. And I will talk about how to mitigate these upsides and downsides here in a little bit with actual specific protocols. Is passive adaptation quite as good as active adaptation as far as all of the benefits? No. Is it better than nothing? 1,000% better than nothing. So a lot of people will say, oh, I don't really just have access to this hot weather. I live in a cool climate. Get yourself access to a hot bath, a hot tub, or a sauna in some way, shape, or form, and you are going to be way better off than just saying, you know what, I'm just not going to do anything. It sounds ridiculous, but like I've heard these excuses before, and it blows my mind, but it's not that hard. You just got to put some effort into it. If you actually care about whatever you're prepping for, put some effort into it, amazing things happen. So consider that. As far as temperatures and things like that, saunas are always going to be like very, very different. If you have an infrared sauna, probably 140 to 150 degrees, you can stay in for a little bit longer. If you have access to a dry sauna, most of those are 165 to 180, 190. Some people crank theirs way up, but they're always going to be different. And as I go through the protocols, you're going to notice that I don't give exact times because of the variance in all these things, but I will give you some subjective things to look out for as far as how to stay in. So let's get into protocols. We're going to talk about a couple different ways that you can go about this and what I would suggest to be like the best approach, but none of the approaches are bad. There's just best and not quite as good, but still good. So the best way to do it would be a combined approach between active and passive, and to do it consistently over time. You can do this for about a month. You could do it for 2 months. You could do it maybe a little longer. You really only need about a month of 3 to 4 times per week heat exposure. I would say lean towards that 4 times per week. And what I would do is pick 2 training sessions throughout the week that are, again, easy or long sessions that don't involve pace specific training. So it could be one easy run that's like 45 minutes to an hour, or it could be an easy run plus a cross training session, or it could be your easy run plus your long run if you're going easy on the long run, or maybe it's only just one session where you do the active and the rest you do passive. Depending on how many times you do your active exposure, you can do passive exposure 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, and that way you're getting your 4 times a week, give or take, exposure, and you're going to benefit tremendously from that because you're not going to over fatigue yourself by doing every session out in the hot weather in the heat, but you're also not going to completely lose that specificity component by only doing sauna or hot bath. So that would be the best approach, and you do that for, again, like I would say at least a month. You can go a little bit shorter, you can go a little longer too. I mean, some people have to go longer just because they only have access to hot weather like for months and months on end, but you kind of get the picture with that. Then you have cramming. So if you've been listening and you are like, shit, I have a race coming up and I have not done any sort of heat exposure, acclimation, adaptation whatsoever, what do I do? This is what you do. So this has to be passive because hopefully if you're doing things right and you're actually caring about your performance coming up in this race, you are tapering. So minimal training. If you do this combined with a bunch of hard training, like if you're peaking for something, it's not going to work because the adaptations are going to wear off, like if you stop too early, which I'll get into. But B, you're also just going to overstress the shit out of yourself. If you're training and hitting like really, really hard workouts and doing what I'm about to get into, it's going to be too much. So cramming in combination with your taper, so reduce volume, maybe some reduced intensity, depending on what you're tapering for, about 10 days at the minimum. You can go up to 14 days where you go every day, pretty much every day. I would say at least 6 days per week, and you do passive heat adaptation. So you're either going in the sauna, the hot bath, whatever you have access to, or a little bit of a combination of both, and you're doing it daily. How long to do it daily? This is where the nuances between different temperatures and different devices and different things that you use really comes into play. Because I could say, oh, just do 30 minutes. What if your sauna is 215 degrees? 30 minutes is going to be like too much. Or what if I say 30 and you have a 140 degree infrared sauna? That might not be enough. So generally speaking, it's very important that you listen to your body when you're doing this and be in tune with how you feel. Maybe check in with yourself the next day just to make sure you're not feeling extra fatigued or run down. But generally, I recommend going until you're mildly uncomfortable. That does not mean you are about to pass out. It does not mean you're on death's door. It means you're mildly uncomfortable, and then you get out. And what you'll find is the more you do it, the more often you do it, the more consistently you do it, which you're going to have to. You're going to have to do it pretty much daily during this period of time, the more able you are to stay in for a little longer. So maybe you start with an average temperature sauna, say it's 170 degrees. And the first time you feel mildly uncomfortable at 15 minutes. Maybe the next day it might be 17 or 18 minutes. Maybe the following day it's 20 minutes. However, your heat tolerance is going to fluctuate up and down. That's just the nature of it. And that's why it's really important to listen to your body and not just go, oh, I did 17 yesterday and today I'm going to go 20. Not recommended. It's going to fluctuate a little, just like your fitness fluctuates. If you always try to add weight to the bar or always try to add reps to the set with the same weight every single week, no matter what, on end, you're going to hurt yourself or you're just going to be really frustrated because it's not linear. And heat tolerance is the same way. So consider that too. Some days it might be a little shorter. Some days it might be a little longer. It also depends on what you did prior. So, maybe it's super hot out. You went for a walk because you're tapering, or you just did a workout, a taper workout, maybe an easy run with some strides, and you're sweating already. Your tolerance to that sauna is going to be lower. That heat is going to be lower, or you're going to want to stay in for a shorter period of time than you would if you hadn't done anything before. You're sitting in the air conditioning and you go in the sauna. It's going to take you a while to heat up. So I can't stress enough. You probably want to err on the side of slightly underdoing it during this time, because if you slightly overdo it, even though you're tapering and you're reducing your training volume and therefore your fatigue and therefore your needs for recovery reserves, if you overdo the heat exposure, you're potentially going to interfere a little bit with the actual taper. And although you might be acclimated to the heat, you might not be quite as fresh as you'd like to be when you show up to actually perform on race day. So consider that as well. Lastly, you can do, if you don't have access to any hot weather, you can do the passive only, where you go in like 4 times per week and you can go in for like 3 weeks to a month instead of doing that cramming if you have time. That's a pretty simple one. Same parameters as the other two. You're just doing passive because you don't have hot weather where you live or whatever. So let's get into some of the important considerations for actually training the heat. So it's really important. Everyone will hit me up around this time of year and be like, hey, dude, I think my fitness is just going down. I feel like I'm regressing. And first thing I ask them is, has anything about the environment that you are training in changed recently? And they're like, yeah, it's hotter and more humid. And I say, that is most likely why. You are very unlikely losing fitness despite training consistently and not changing anything. It's probably environmental. So with that in mind, just note that when you go on your training runs, your pace is going to be slower, or your heart rate is going to be higher at the same pace, or your RPE is going to be higher at the same pace. And the next question that usually comes from that is, so what should I do? Should I just accept my heart rate being higher and still go at that same pace? Or should I slow down even though I'm going way slower than usual just to keep my heart rate in the same spot? And the answer is yes and no. And it depends. Sometimes if you're feeling great, accepting the fact that your heart rate's going to be a little higher because of the heat, not because you're going extra hard, but because of the heat jacket that you're wearing, like I talked about earlier, is totally fine. If you are feeling a little bit under recovered, or you're feeling a little run down, or you're just not feeling great for that run, then maybe it's a good idea to go a little slower and accept the fact that you're going a little slower and keep that heart rate within range. And it's therefore going to be a less prominent stress on your body and affect your recovery a little bit less afterwards. So there's no perfect way to approach it, but just being a little bit in tune with your body and not lying to yourself and being honest with yourself about how you're feeling that day and how things are going that day can go a long way in general with fitness, but especially with hot weather. Generally, I like to use RPE over heart rate for these sessions for really anyone, because we already talked about what types of sessions to do in hot weather and which ones to use sparingly in hot weather or do a little bit less of in hot weather for most people. Your pace doesn't really matter that much at all. Your pace does not matter for zone 2. If normally when it's nice out, you're running 9-minute miles in zone 2, give or take, and it just got hot out, maybe you're not adapted yet and you have to run 9:45 miles or 10-minute miles, that's going to affect your race pace zero. It's not going to affect your race pace at all. You're going for systemic, not specific adaptations. So being able to accept that is part of being an adult and making long-term progress and recovering well and performing well and not being too tied to your paces and not letting your ego get into the way and doing the right thing rather than the thing that feels best for your ego and your pride. So that is one consideration. You can use heart rate, but like I said, just be more mindful of what is causing your higher heart rates. It's going to be the fact that it's hot out, not necessarily the fact that you are getting less fit. Of course, your heart rate's going to fluctuate anyway, regardless of the weather. There's about 100 other factors that can affect heart rate besides the temperature. So consider that as well. If you're a higher level runner and you've been using heart rate for a long time, then I would say, yeah, probably use heart rate and RPE. You probably use both interchangeably anyway. But for other people that are a little less advanced, or if you're the type of person that gets super obsessed with heart rate, you don't make any decisions yourself, you just allow your watch to make every decision for you, then you probably want to learn how to use RPE and also use RPE for these training sessions. And then maybe you can use your watch to guide your pacing on your faster runs, which is a lot more important anyway, or rucks or bikes, whatever you're doing. As far as hydration, remember we talked about hydration being a factor, but not the only factor. It is still a big time factor. And your goal is not necessarily to stay hydrated completely perfectly the entire time, because that would require an insane amount of water intake, and your body can only handle so much water per hour while you're stressed out and actually performing. So a lot of people will think like, oh, it's 85 degrees out, I need to double my water intake compared to when it's 45 degrees out. No, you definitely don't need to double it. Maybe 6 to 8 ounces of water more per hour when it's super hot out than you take in when it's relatively comfortable out. Water intake depends on your size. It depends on how much you practice water intake on your training sessions, but somewhere in the 16 to 32 ounces of water range per hour is a pretty good range to shoot for. Bigger people, people who sweat more, people who take training seriously and actually practice their hydration during training will probably be able to take in closer to 32 ounces, no problem. People who just always blow it off, or they're smaller, or they don't sweat as much, or they're just newer to running and they don't really have a good grasp on how much water to take in per hour, probably start with that 16-ish and then maybe work up to 20 and then maybe 24 and so on and so forth. However, remember that thing I said about water not being the only part of hydration? Electrolytes too. They matter big time. So sodium is by far the most important one. So if you're slamming a bunch of high potassium coconut water, you're totally fine to do that away from training. Potassium is super important. But during training, you really want to focus on sodium. In fact, even if you only take sodium in for electrolytes during training, you're going to be way better off than just slamming a bunch of coconut water. Or Body Armor. Body Armor is another sports drink that's super high in potassium, does not have much sodium, and that's totally missing the forest for the trees. So sodium is also going to be very, very different from person to person. It depends on your sweat rate. It depends on how salty your sweat is or not salty. And there are some rudimentary ways to determine how salty your sweat is. And there's also some more scientific and specific ways. Rudimentary ways, if I went for a run with this brand new hat and it had like salt around the rims, or if you notice when you sweat, your eyes get really stingy and red, like mine do. I am a very salty sweater. Then that's kind of an indicator to go towards the higher end of the range I'm about to say. If you are not really all that salty, like you can't taste salt, like you get sweaty, but you don't see the actual salt stains on your hat or your shirt, or you don't really notice your eyes stinging or getting red after heavy sweating, then you're probably a little lower sodium sweater. So this range is going to be pretty big because there's a big discrepancy between people. Sweating is very, very highly correlated to genetics. Some people just sweat like crazy. Some people don't sweat as much. Some people have very high salty sweat. Some people have lower salt in their sweat. And that's mostly genetic. But like I said, depending on how much you've been heat training and the adaptations that you've made, you might be a less salty sweater than you used to be because you've been doing your heat training consistently. So always consider those things. If you want to get more granular and more specific with it, you can purchase, and they're not that expensive, you can purchase patches from, I think Gatorade makes them, probably some other companies too, that you just put on your skin. I don't even think you have to train in order for it to actually calculate approximately how much sodium per hour you're potentially going to lose. But just read the instructions and put them on. I've done it before a really long time ago, and I remember I didn't train for it. They just put it on for, I don't know how long it was, and it told me you're a salty sweater. So the range for sodium would be somewhere between 500 to 1200 milligrams of sodium per hour for most people. Some people might need a little less. Some people might need a little more. It depends on what the temperature is. It depends on generally how much salt you eat in your daily nutrition. But somewhere in that range is probably pretty good. But also consider trying different things in training. One of the main benefits of training is not just improved fitness, but for endurance, it's also getting used to fueling. It's getting used to hydrating. It is learning your body and what works best and what doesn't work. So if you try, say, 750 milligrams of sodium for your first session and 24 ounces of water, and you come back and you're way lighter after an hour run, you lost, say, 3-4 pounds, you might need more water. You might need more sodium. If you try that and you're just miserable the whole time and maybe you didn't lose any weight during your run, you're just naturally in hot weather going to lose weight. That's just part of it. Of course, it's transient. It's all water weight. You can regain that by hydrating afterwards. But if you try that out and it just feels like it's too much, or you feel like you could get less, or you might just be really uncomfortable taking in all that water, then dial it back. Maybe 16 ounces of water, 500 milligrams of sodium, and titrate up and down based on that. There's no perfect amount. No one's ever going to get this like perfect exact equation. You can use what's called the Galpin equation that Andy Galpin created. I think just Google it and that'll give you a good idea of exactly based on your body weight and probably some other factors, how much water and electrolytes to take in per hour. But even that's not going to be dead on accurate, perfect, but it doesn't really matter. Practice, experiment, see how you feel, and go from there. But just remember that sodium and water are both very important. One without the other, not really all that beneficial. Honestly, a lot of people do this too. A lot of people will just slam regular water the entire time. And if they're not taking in things that have sodium, whether it's food or something like that, they're just diluting their electrolytes even further. And it's a net negative. You're better off not taking in anything than you are just slamming a bunch of water probably. So always consider the sodium. It's super critical and it's going to significantly affect your performance. You're less likely to cramp. You're also more likely to just put up better numbers. Also, just because you're training in the heat and you're going for these heat adaptations does not mean that you can't periodically cool yourself. It's probably a really good idea to cool yourself. You can still get great heat adaptations from, say, a 90-minute session, and every 30 minutes you stop and put an ice towel around your neck for a couple minutes, or you have a cooler, maybe you pass by a cooler on your running route and you put a bunch of ice cubes in your hat, or you dunk your arms. The surface area on the inside of your arms is great for like dunking in cold water or ice or something like that to kind of cool your core temperature down. But anywhere, your neck, your armpits, your groin, your head, the back of your neck, all great spots to periodically cool yourself and keep your core temperature down a little bit. And you're still going to get great heat adaptations for the next 30 minutes that you're actually out in the heat, and you're probably keeping yourself a little safer, and you're going to make your time a little less miserable, and you're also going to perform better when you do that. And it doesn't necessarily have to be ice from a cooler or anything like that. You don't have to get crazy with it. If there's a river or a lake, even if the water is lukewarm, it's not freezing, it's just kind of lukewarm, which it probably will be if it's hot outside, it's still going to make a difference if you get some on your face and maybe dunk your arms in it, or maybe just splash some on your chest. Not perfect, not like putting ice in your hat or anything like that, but it's still going to help. And you can also just kind of try and plan your routes in areas that are a little more shady than otherwise. Just because I mentioned earlier, the sun is a big factor and it's just going to beat down on you. And also, it's going to burn the shit out of you if you're in the sun for hours and hours and hours. So just using some common sense, maybe changing some things up based on what your running plan is for that day, based on your ability to cool yourself in certain places using certain tools, can go a long way, even if it's a little less convenient than what you're used to. All right, so a few little miscellaneous things before we get into safety, and then we'll wrap it up. So timing is everything. When you heat train with improper timing, like you stop doing it too early or you don't do it long enough, it's not useless, but it's also not as beneficial. The adaptations from heat begin after about 4 to 7 exposures, and they maximize at like 10 to 14, which is why that cramming protocol, 10, 12, 14 days, is a great option. But if you only do like 4 days of cramming, you're going to get a little bit of heat adaptation, but it's really not going to be all that much. You want to at least get those 10 to 14 days. And again, that can be either all at once with a cramming protocol, or it can be more spread out. But They occur in about that period of time, but also they go away a lot faster. So they'll start going away or they'll start dropping off, and you'll be less primed to perform in the heat after about 3 days. And they'll be pretty much negligible after about a week. No heat exposure. So the important takeaway from that is you want to time it properly. So if you're doing the cramming protocol and you finish the cramming protocol 5 days before you're performing, the adaptations are not completely gone by the time you do your race or your event, but they're largely almost negated by the fact that you stopped it too early. So you want to get that last heat exposure. What I usually recommend is 2 days out or 3 days out, because you don't want to necessarily go in the sauna, or you definitely don't want to do like a hard heat training session the day before, because that's just going to be too much of a stressor. But also you don't want to do it too far out because they're just, like I said, going to be minimal. So if you can do your last heat exposure, whether you did cramming or whether you did the more continuous exposures, about 3 days out, maybe even 2 days out, especially if it's passive, you're just going in the sauna for like 30 minutes, 2 days prior to the race, then you're going to be primed to perform come race day or event day. So make sure you get the timing right and make sure you give it enough time, and don't do like 5 days of heat training and then quit 5 days out. You're pretty much not really doing much at all. You might be a little bit more mentally able to handle the heat because you expose yourself to it a little, but the actual physiological adaptations are going to be limited. So consider that. Now, lastly, to wrap it up, we'll talk safety because this is very important. I talked about the fact that there's a fine line between tough and absolutely dumb, and something that's going to potentially backfire on you either acutely or just going to make it so that you are more stressed out, make it so that recovery is harder, and it's going to interfere with your fitness more if you cross the line too often for dumb. Of course, if you go way too long, or if you go way too hard, or a combination of those things, or if you just aren't yet adapted or used to the heat and you just expose yourself to way too much heat too soon, think of it as like when you just start out running and you just go for a 10-mile run your first time at max effort. Of course, you're going to mess yourself up. That's not a good idea. Same with heat. Of course, there's a little bit more gray area with like how much is too much, how much is not enough, but you definitely should not go out and just expect to feel perfectly comfortable the entire time and everything is fine and dandy. But it shouldn't be so uncomfortable that it's potentially like messing up your vision or making it feel like you're going to pass out or anything crazy like that. Like, have some common sense, be reasonable with it, and slowly but surely increase the amount of exposure you get. Don't go out and start with a 90-minute long run all in the heat before you have any other heat exposure under your belt. Maybe start with a 30-minute run or a 35-minute run and increase in small amounts over time. Same with sauna. Just having some common sense goes a long way. Making sure you're hydrated, making sure you're cooling yourself periodically, making sure you are not doing anything too crazy, too much, too soon, too long, too hot, whatever it is going to help you not only perform better and make more progress in your fitness, not only get better heat adaptations long term, but also reduce your chances of getting a heat injury or potentially dying from excessive heat exposure. So that's it, guys. I know I said that was going to be a quick episode, but it took a little longer. Hopefully you got something good out of it, and hopefully you can use some of the tools and strategies that I mentioned throughout the episode to your benefit to go and smash your upcoming hot weather event. I'll be back soon with another episode. Till then, Terminator out.